Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm happy to introduce today Professor Dr. Philipp Cimiano and Dr. Soufian Jebbara from Semalytix in Bielefeld, Germany. So Philipp started around at the same time at Bielefeld University as me, where he joined as a professor and head of the Semalytic computing group and is affiliated with the Cognitive Interaction Technology Excellence Cluster. And as a bachelor student, I actually visited his lectures on databases. Philipp is editorial board member of the Semantic Web Journal, and he's co-founder of Semalytix and Mercury AI. Soufian started 1 year after me at Bielefeld University, where we met actually at his freshman events. He studied cognitive informatics and intelligent systems, and he did his PhD with Philipp, where he worked on different topics in the areas of natural language processing and information extraction. And since 2017, he works at Semalytix, where he is now the AI and machine learning lead. Semalytix emerged from the master thesis of my friend Yannick Jaskolski with Philipp as supervisor. Starting in 2015, the company grew to a team with now around 70 employees and 4 company dogs. Semalytix's mission is to give pharma companies the possibility to really understand their patients in order to improve effectiveness and impact of treatments. And Semalytix does this by extracting real-world evidence from many different patient online forums and presenting them in an understandable and interactive way. I'm excited to hear and learn more about their work on natural language processing for real-world evidence generation. And if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, and then in the end, we will take all questions, or just wait until the end, and then you can just unmute yourself and ask the questions. Okay, thanks.
Okay, yes, so I'm Philipp Cimiano, and thanks a lot for the nice introduction, Linda. We are very happy to be here today. As you mentioned, for us, this is afternoon, so good morning to you. We're going to talk about Semalytix, so about our company, which, as Linda mentioned, wait a minute, Soufian, don't be so quick. So we're going to talk about the company and about what we do. We are spun off a research group from Bielefeld University, as Linda said, and what we do is apply cutting-edge research methods, in particular from the field of natural language processing, to a very particular problem, which is generating evidence from data about how treatments work and about the experiences that patients have with treatment, but also to understand their needs. So in the first part, I will introduce the company, and I will talk about this main use case that we have, which is real-world evidence generation. I will explain why this is important. And then in the second part, Soufian will tell you a bit about the technology that is behind and the main use cases and sort of applications that we're currently looking at. Okay, so yes, so we are a company that was spun off the Semantic Computing Group at Bielefeld University in 2015. So here you see the 3 founders. So I'm very happy to have co-founded this company with Yannick Jaskolski, that was mentioned already by Linda, and by Matthias Hartung. I'm acting as Chief Technology Officer of the company. So next slide, please, Soufian. So in a nutshell, what we do is we're supporting patient-focused drug development, and our goal is to contribute to reducing the disease burden of billions of patients. So there are many diseases around the world where we don't have yet effective treatments, or where the treatments that are currently on the market are not really addressing the most pressing issues that patients face. And we want to empower pharmaceutical companies to focus on what really matters to patients in their drug development processes. Next slide, please. So you can see this also as a contribution to helping to shape a healthcare system that focuses on value. And to focus on what is valuable to patients, we need to understand a number of questions. So we need to understand what are their most important and urgent needs, what trade-offs do they make when they decide to go for a treatment or not, so what preferences do they have, how do they balance, for example, efficacy versus safety of a treatment, and how does actually their condition impact their quality of life. So in which aspects of their life are patients restricted by the disease? How severe are these restrictions? And in general, what is the real value that a therapy offers for patients? And answering these questions is crucial to determine whether we are investing our resources, our economic resources, but also personnel resources into the healthcare system in an optimal way by putting patients at the center of what we do. And of course, this is nothing that is, I mean, we are a company that is based in Germany, but of course, all these things, this is nothing that is specific basically to specific countries. I mean, these are questions and issues that we face all over the world. I mean, everywhere we should be concerned about how to leverage most of our investments into the healthcare system. Next slide, please. So look, there are different interpretations of therapeutic value, and these differ depending on who you ask. For example, patients are interested in individual improvements to their life that they experience when they take a particular drug. Yeah, so they are concerned with their own outcomes and own improvements. Now we have payers, I mean, those who finance all healthcare interventions. They have an economic point of view, and they want to understand whether a certain treatment at the level of the whole patient population is, from an economic perspective, worthwhile compared to other treatments that are on the market. And then we have providers, so pharmaceutical companies that invest a lot of into development of drugs. And of course, at the end, they want to make sure that by reimbursement from payers, they get their costs reimbursed, and they also have appropriate margins. At the same time, they are very concerned also about making sure that they address the actual needs that patients have. So, but along all these different interpretations, there are clearly trade-offs. Yeah, and as societies, when we look at what is the best way to invest into healthcare, we need to look at all these different interpretations of value and resolve them in an optimal way. And the key to do this, next slide, is looking at evidence. So at things that are objectively measurable and that sort of abstract from basically the individual goals of all these agents. But we need to look at, well, what is the evidence that speaks for the fact that we have treatments that are of high value. And this is sort of the area in which we are. We are trying to use data and data-driven methods and technology to inform decision-making about what are the best treatments that we have on the market, but also understanding what are the most pressing needs of patients that these treatments are addressing, so that we can have an objective quantification of the value of our investments into the healthcare system. So next slide, please. So how is this done currently? Well, you know that we have this mechanism, proven mechanism of the randomized controlled clinical trial, where we typically have different phases. I mean, I think by now many people are experts in this because we follow very closely the developments of vaccines and the approval processes of vaccines. So many people now know that there are these different phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and we're typically comparing populations that receive treatment to control groups to see basically whether we can show a causal effect of a treatment. And this for a long time has been the gold standard approach to generating evidence. But at the same time, it is limited, and that's why we're looking into generating other types of evidence that can complement this sort of more classical way of generating evidence. Next slide. So the limitations of clinical trials are that often the size of population sample we have might be quite limited. So think of very rare conditions where we could recruit maybe a few dozen or under 100 patients that have a certain condition. Sometimes in clinical trials, the populations are defined in a very narrow way. So sometimes excluding people with comorbidities or with complicated conditions. But in the reality, this is often the rule, yeah, that people have comorbidities or have sort of complicated cases in which the condition is complicated due to a number of other things. And so very often the populations examined in clinical trials don't correspond to the actual broad sort of population that we find in reality. Sometimes very rare side effects are not observed. We had this also recently with some vaccines that went into the market. Sometimes the aspects that are really important to patients that really have an impact on their life are not captured. We often look into clinical outcomes, but clinical outcomes might not always be meaningful to patients in terms of really changing their condition and making their life way better. And sometimes we look at certain improvements that might be statistically significant, but the magnitude of improvement at the end of the day is quite irrelevant to the patient because it doesn't come up with a real qualitative improvement. So, so this is the reason, next slide, why we're turning more and more into gathering additional data from the healthcare system that can tell us something about how do therapies really work beyond clinical studies, okay, beyond these very controlled settings. And so the definition of real world data is these are data relating to patient health status or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. So examples are electronic health records, patient registries, claim databases, sales data, or even adverse event registries. And we call evidence generated from such data sources real world evidence. And now my question, if you click, please, is whose perspective do these data actually capture? Okay, so if you look at all these data sets, so they reflect the clinician's perspective about the patient. So these are all things that doctors, HCPs capture, reflecting their perspective of patient needs, improvements, clinical outcomes, but they don't reflect the subjective needs of patients in their words and don't show what is most pressing to them in their condition. So therefore, next slide. Our mission is to let the patient's voice be heard. And we're looking into social media, which is sort of the biggest source of patient experience data that exists as of today. So we have close to 4 billion people actively using social media. So close to 60% of the world's population active there. And we have actually 72% of internet users using the internet to seek and share health information. So this is quite massive. And in Europe, if you ask people, there are some studies. So 3/4 of the population consider the internet as a good way of looking for health information. Now we could ask, what is the motivation for people to share information, right? You could say this is really weird, right? People are sharing very intimate and very sensitive information about their health, yeah? And there are very good reasons for doing this. I mean, people do this because it helps them to self-manage and control their condition by learning from others that have the same disease. Sometimes it's a way to share their emotions, so it's like a way of creating relief. There's a community support phenomenon of people who share the same concerns, getting together and being able to share. Sometimes it's also about comparison. So how well or bad off am I compared to others? So this gives something like a relation to others. And in general, also seeking information, educating oneself, or even improved psychological well-being by being able to share and relate to others who have the same condition. So there are many important reasons why people are doing this. And our mission is to give all these people a voice by analyzing this and summarizing this to a point where it allows pharmaceutical companies, but other actors, to sort of act upon what we learn from what patients share. So next slide, please. So now I go to the technical challenge. So the big challenge is really recovering sort of patients' trajectories from what they say in social media. So you might imagine that here you see a timeline, which might be the trajectory of an individual patient. So the patient might observe some symptoms, then go to the doctor, get a diagnosis, then get a first treatment, possibly some adverse reactions to that treatment, which leads to a treatment stop, then another treatment, and so forth. And if you look at social media, you find you find millions of these stories. Yeah, but they are, of course, in an unstructured way, so they are text. And our goal is, how can we recover those trajectories in a structured way from the unstructured content that people share? Next slide. And so doing this at high precision is a big challenge. So I want to give you examples of questions that you need to be able to precisely answer on the basis of your analysis. So you need to understand who's speaking. Is that a patient? Is it the relative of a patient? Is it a HCP? So has the patient really been diagnosed, or is the patient just talking about this condition? So what symptoms does the author of a post actually suffer from and not just mention en passant? Does the patient actually have the disease, or is he just talking about it? And then which treatments did the patient try, in which order, and with what success? Or does the author report any side effects? So did they actually have them, or are they just expressing the fear of the side effects? Were there any adherence problems? What were the reasons why the patient stopped the treatment? And how did the treatment actually improve their quality of life? So this is really huge. Okay, so there are many challenges to being able to precisely capture these trajectories. Next slide. So very quickly, our architecture consists of something we call the hyperstream, Sphinx AI, and Pharos. So hyperstream is basically the collection of all these patient narratives. So it's a big database where we have where we have crawled fora for all different conditions. So this is the basis for all our analysis. Then we have Sphinx AI. We will talk about this in more detail, which is actually the library of algorithms that we apply to answering all these questions that I showed before. And then we have Pharos, which is the front end by which our customers interact with all this, getting access to dashboards and seeing even trends in real time. Next slide. Okay, so let us say that technically we have a big crawling infrastructure that allows us to crawl all this content. We have a pre-processing architecture that does anonymization, translation for 11 languages. Then we do entity recognition by a large knowledge graph that we have built up that gives us background knowledge of the pharma domain. And then we have machine learning based NLP models that Soufian will talk about to solve all these problems. Yeah, detecting whether this is a patient, what kind of condition the patient has, symptoms and side effects, patient-reported outcomes, detection of severity of symptoms, detection of importance of certain aspects of their life to patient, and at least 30 more different models that we use. Okay, next slide. So this is, I think, my last slide before I hand over to Soufian. So this is powered by background knowledge that we capture in the form of a knowledge graph. So this means that if we spot certain entities in text, we don't only have spot these entities, but we are able to relate them to a wider network of related knowledge. So when we find something like Victoza, which is a treatment, a drug, we know basically we can contextualize this by knowing sort of which is the active agent, how it is administered, who is the manufacturer, what kind of effects does this have. So we have a completely different level of being able to interpret a text, because we can contextualize this with further knowledge that we have about all these entities. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so I would now like to hand over to Soufian to look a bit more in detail into our algorithms and to look into some of the tasks that we're solving that are already introduced.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much so far. All right, I will use the next few slides to talk about the algorithms and the natural language processing tasks that we are interested at Semalytix. Yeah, we'll start this with an example and then move on to some specific challenges and also give a bit more detail on one or two topics. All right, so let's look at this example to get a better understanding of the kind of information we want to extract from these patient reports. And here in the center, you see a sentence, which is actually just an excerpt from a larger report. And the sentence states, "I am in constant pain and I hate that it completely stops me from going to work." And yeah, there are a few things that we want to detect and extract in a structured way from this sentence. For example, here on the left, we can start with the question, what are the mentioned symptoms? So here we can identify the symptom pain and can also locate this in our knowledge graph as a specific entity. And this entity is then, of course, linked to other diseases, to treatments. So we know which diseases are associated with this symptom. We know the medications that might treat this. And also from this sentence, we can learn that the patient is actually experiencing the symptom in contrast to just mentioning it. I think Philipp mentioned this as well, the importance of this. In addition, we also see the severity of the symptom, for example. Here we have this modifier constant pain, which indicates or implies to us that there is a high severity for the patient for this particular symptom. And yeah, on the other side, on the right side, we can see that the patient talks about his or her mobility. So the quality of life is affected here by this symptom, by this relation here. The quality of life facet is this specific aspect of mobility here. This is also included in a larger hierarchy of different quality of life facets and dimensions. I will later talk about those a bit more. And we also can see that the quality of life of the mobility here is negatively affected by this symptom. So I think we see in this example a lot of different tasks already, and we call those usually concepts, so the things that we want to detect in a text, such as the severity, the patient affliction. And while this is not a comprehensive overview of what we extract, it already gives a nice overview of the different kind of tasks that we are trying to solve. For example, to extract the structured knowledge we saw on the previous slide, we can leverage different NLP methodologies, such as text classification, which helps us which these general questions like which documents or sentences talk about a specific concept X. We have named entity recognition, if we really want to locate them in the text, or if we want to detect entities. Those entities, we of course want to link them to our knowledge graph, which we can then use to answer what diseases or treatments or other pharma entities are talked about. Yeah, another type of tasks that we have is what we call target-dependent classification. We can use this or apply this when we already know about, for example, a symptom, but we want to know how the people really talk about this symptom in their life, or also for treatments maybe, and also, for example, to measure how severe a symptom is for a patient. And lastly, we also have relation classification. So we want to see the effect between two different kinds of entities that we can detect. Okay, so the named entities, they could look like this. So we have a document. We try to recognize the specific mention of brain mets here, which is then linked to the knowledge graph. We have the drug products on the other side, which are mentioned. And the challenge with this task is, first of all, that we have a lot of entity types. So we have drug products, drug agents, diseases, methods of administration, and many more. And all of these different types, they are also associated with a lot of specific entities. So, for example, diseases like diabetes mellitus, type 2, psoriasis, abdominal pain, and so on. And for the diseases, for example, we currently have about 16,000 diseases in the knowledge graph, and drug products and drug agents together about 14,000. So you can see that it can be quite tricky to really identify all of these different entities in our documents. And we also have the requirement that we can do this really fast, because we often use the information about specific entities that we already found in document to pre-select the data and decide which documents are relevant for further analysis and which are not. The good thing is that often these pharma entities are described by quite specific medical terms, so they can be more or less unambiguous at times, which simplifies our recognition and linking. We also saw these quality of life facets or dimensions. So we have these quality of life dimensions. These are the bold titles that you see here. And those are heavily inspired by the definitions of the World Health Organization. So the dimensions are here, the 5 categories: physical health, psychological health, level of independence, social relationships, and environment. And what we call facets are these more fine-grained parts of these dimensions, of which we currently have about, or currently try to detect about 20 different ones. And this is what it would look like in a document. So for cognitive capabilities, it could be expressed like, I forgot simple things, I could not multitask, forgot my words, could no longer explain something, and so on. Energy and motivation could be expressed by the energy levels, and healthcare availability can be referenced with a diabetics meeting at the local Tesco superstore. So you see that the different mentions are quite diverse, and they are not really, I mean, we cannot treat them like named entities because they don't follow this normal structure, and they can be sometimes quite implied and instead of being stated explicitly in a document. One quite straightforward approach for this is, for simple concepts, we can try to write some kind of linguistic patterns. And for this, to really bootstrap some first analysis, we develop this kind of pattern language, which you can think of as regular expressions with a connection to our knowledge graph. And with that, for example, for the concept of tolerability, we can write individual patterns that already cover many of the ways people express the concept of tolerability, such as here we have this first part consists of a variant of the word tolerate, and then our link to the knowledge graph to detect all the drug products that we know of. And yeah, as I said, with this, we can cover a large portion of interesting mentions and also have a very interpretable model in the background. Of course, we cannot really apply this to everything that we want to detect because not everything is easily recognized with these finite sets of patterns. So we also need some other approaches with a bit more sophisticated techniques behind it. For these quality of life concepts, the key challenges for us are, first of all, that there are quite many, and that detecting them requires a lot of expert domain knowledge, either for the people who try to define these patterns, but also for the annotators who try to produce annotations for evaluation and supervised learning. And additionally, the concepts are quite rare sometimes. So some appear very often, but others, for example, only in less than 1% of documents. So finding relevant documents for annotations is tricky. So model development is also, can be challenging. The next part is the target-dependent classification, and here I would look or present a bit more detail. With target-dependent classification, we basically mean classification with respect to a specific mention of an entity in a text. So we assume that we already detected relevant diseases, for example. Here we have in this document, I'm also using my own hyaluronic acid serum because I get the opposite of acne. I get super dry skin. Here we have two mentions of symptoms like acne and dry skin. And we want to know if the author of this post states that he or she has this symptom or not. So is he or she afflicted or not? And we need to consider that there might be multiple mentions of entities in a single sentence, as it is in this example, and also the different kinds of entities that we want to classify here are basically the things that we can find in our knowledge graph. So there are a lot of different things that are of interest. So the approach should be more or less agnostic to the specific entities. And ideally, this approach would be applicable to other tasks as well with a similar structure. For example, measuring the severity of a symptom. So here we have the symptom given and want to know if the author states a specific severity. Yeah, and we explored a few implementation options for this kind of classification. One of these options looks like this. So we start here on the right at the bottom. We have the sentence, I get the opposite of acne, I get super dry skin. We already know these blue boxes here at the bottom. Those are the entities that we know of. And yeah, then we would pass this text to our encoder. Ideally, it's pre-trained on some kind of relevant data for our domain, which then produces these embeddings at the top. And then we would perform some kind of pooling to only select a portion of the sentence that is relevant, for example, the target tokens, and use those to make a prediction for this entity. So ideally, the encoder already extracts enough information to make a good decision here. And since we, for acne, we would look at a different section of the document, the classification would also be a different one at the end. Sorry. Okay, so we put this model architecture to the test and, and trained it on a bunch of data and different target tasks and target entities. And for this task, the results are actually quite nice with a relatively high prediction quality. So you see we reach about 90% F-score for deciding if a patient talks about being afflicted by a specific symptom. We also applied this to a different task, as I mentioned, severity of symptoms. And here we see that this classification task is much harder, and we have quite different scores across different classes. So the performance here ranges from about 58% to 84% F-score, depending on the class. And yeah, one reason for this is probably that patient affliction is really much less fuzzy. It is really usually quite clear stated if a patient experiences a symptom or not. Whereas for severity, the boundaries between the individual classes are not so clear cut. So it's much more like fine-grained sentiment analysis, where it's not perfectly clear if something should be estimated at medium severity or high severity. Yeah, overall, there are a couple of challenges that we are still facing here. So regarding this target-dependent classification, and some of them are, for example, the question, what is the best architecture to represent the text and the specific target mentions? So we have the option, there were different options for this pooling operation that I described. In our example, we classified individual mentions, but maybe there's a benefit to classifying the document as a whole with all the possible entities at once. So there might be some kind of benefit in doing this joint classification. then, of course, we could explore how our knowledge graph could actually help us with this kind of classification. In our model, we just used it as a way to provide the entities in a document, but we did not leverage the relations in the knowledge graph itself. And also would be interesting to see if linguistic knowledge could help us here a bit more, for example, by, by leveraging the dependency tree. But again, we are working with social media, and these kind of things usually do not work so well in this kind of domain due to the informal writing style. So this would definitely be interesting to explore a bit more. Okay, and next topic is a bit different. So besides these very clearly defined concepts that we are interested in, there are also unknown topics that might prove relevant for the understanding of the disease burdens of patients. Therefore, we also want to know what are people talking about, which we did not foresee. And one way to approach this would be by, for example, topic modeling. But usually we don't want to have these very broad topics, but rather more fine-grained topics. But if we introduce a lot of these topics, we also need some kind of hierarchy. So this is a very challenging task for us to group documents automatically into some kind of buckets that we can then easily browse and make explorable. And also it's quite valuable to note how people are actually talking about their lives with the disease and how they express this. So what are common verbalizations? But then again, this differs from disease to disease. So that is still an open challenge. One way to address this is to detect key phrases in our domain and to organize them then in a way that facilitates exploration of documents. And we can see this in this scatter plot of key phrases. So we can try to observe common phrases in our data set, and then maybe cluster them by their similarity so that we get these blobs of common phrases where here at the bottom, there are phrases about the oral medication or administration. And on the one hand, this kind of information could help us in our model development because it can help us decide what kind of phrases are interesting and could influence maybe the model development itself, but also the exploration of the data itself is also quite valuable already. Lastly, I would give a brief look towards some things that we are still developing or plan to develop. So I already mentioned that we want to have or want to make some relations more explicit between symptoms and quality of life aspects, for example. And it's, we're still looking for the best way to do this. And as opposed to this very simple example, where we have all the ingredients neatly in one single sentence, this is not really the reality sometimes, because in reality, we have to look at large documents and the relevant information is really spread across this entire thing, consisting of several sentences and maybe even several posts. And all these documents, they contain several symptoms, several quality of life mentions usually, and all of this makes the extraction task obviously much harder, and which then requires more sophisticated machine reading capabilities. So I cannot present the perfect solution right now, but we have some interesting things in the making. But maybe we can start a discussion about this. This is all that I would present. There are some. Maybe Philipp, you want to take over the summary and play the video?
Yeah. So thanks, Soufian. So I think we are almost at the end of the talk, but I would like to summarize a bit where we are. So I think we wanted to convey what our mission is, so which is to contributing to the reducing burden of disease by helping to focus investments in the healthcare system and drug development where they basically unfold the most value for patients. So we are investing into social media as a key source, and it's nice to see that also the FDA, for example, recently has published guidelines on what they call patient-focused drug development, where they acknowledge social media as one key source for capturing the subjective patient experience to complement more traditional sources. I think from a technical perspective, we wanted to show you that this is a very interesting and challenging also natural language processing problem to recover basically the trajectories of patients from all these unstructured content. And we think that where are we in comparison to maybe competitors? So where is our USP? We would say that we clearly have the most advanced technology, but at the same time, we feel that we are still only scratching the surface, as Soufian mentioned, because there are quite some challenges ahead of us. And as Soufian mentioned, of course, I think in many cases, we don't have yet the machine reading technology and models at hand that would able really to go for a deep understanding of all these texts. So having said that, I would like to close with a short video that I think summarizes quite nicely what we do. So can I share?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I leave it. And then I'm happy to open the floor for questions. Let me try to find the video. Okay, so can you see this, the screen? Okay, let's go for it.
Yeah.
Imagine you could listen systematically to the authentic voices of patients across the globe. Every day, millions of patients share their experiences, needs, and burdens on social media, forums, and other online sources. Being able to hear these voices brings immense opportunities for increasing treatment benefits and value by focusing on what patients really need and on what would improve their quality of life.
Currently, we work with market research agencies, we interview patients and physicians, and this process is still very valid, but it's prone to biases, and from start to finish, it can take months. And what we really need is a solution that can analyze real-world conversations and help us get to the why.
Semalytix' mission is to provide pharmaceutical decision makers and other stakeholders in the health system with a full and accurate picture about patients' needs on the basis of insight derived from an unprecedented data set comprised of the voices of 1 billion algorithmically verified patients.
We've built a world-leading machine-reading artificial intelligence that is capable of reading digitalized text and understand it the same way a human medical expert would, and it's also capable of explaining what it read back to you.
Semalytix Pharos Pharma Analytics platform uses novel AI-based automated text comprehension and storytelling technologies to summarize the trajectories of millions of patients. The platform reads and interprets online forums and social media posts using the latest advances in machine learning and natural language processing technology. It extracts key insights from patients' online conversations in real time to provide you with a 360-degree view of their needs, effectively eliminating biases in current market research methods. Pharos provides access to patient listening studies that provide key patient insights on questions such as, what burdens do patients suffer from? What unmet needs do they have? Which preferences and trade-offs influence their treatment choices? What makes them really feel better? Pharos can be used across functions to focus on the needs of patients throughout the entire drug development and commercialization lifecycle.
We've used this technology to answer key intelligence questions about treatment gaps and unmet needs. We could even use it to answer questions that we didn't even think about answering, so unknown unknowns. And we've also used this technology to optimize product development, identify patient unmet needs, and put the patients at the center of what we do.
What are your unknown unknowns? Find your answers with our Pharos Pharma Analytics platform.
Okay, so thank you very much for your attention, and we are more than happy to discuss with you and see if you have any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this nice presentation and also the nice video at the end. It's nice seeing some people there I recognize. So maybe I quickly start with one question. So I was talking with my mother today about this talk you were going to give, and I was explaining her, so she's not an expert on this. I was explaining her what you do, and then she had this very good question, which was how do you ensure that what the patient says is actually true, so that there's not somebody in some online forum just wanting to have attention?
Yes, actually, that's a very good question, and we haven't figured out how to solve that challenge yet. Okay, so it's true that there is also some bias in online data. Obviously, I mean, we don't know if people are really reflecting things they've really lived or experienced, or whether they're inventing something. But yeah, I mean, this is something that might something we have to address in the future. But currently, we don't have this. Yeah. The benefits, the way we are positioning this is that currently what happens is that typically the subjective experience of the patients is not considered at all in exercises in which or let's say, I wouldn't say at all, okay, that would be to go too far, but it's not considered very systematically in evaluation of treatments and so forth, and sort of determining value. So in spite of also these problems that you mentioned, Linda, it's still if you look at all the data we have, not at the individual patient, but at everything we aggregate, gives, in our view, a very fair very fair picture of what are the main issues that patients struggle with as a collective. Okay, and it's also important to understand that we never go down to the single patient, because we process data in an anonymized fashion. So it's never at the end about sort of really individual patients. It's about what we learn from the collective, and how can this inform our investments into products and so forth.
Okay, thanks. Are there more questions?
A quick question. So I'm from Vector. Very interesting talk. I was just wondering, from the knowledge graph. So do you develop that first in hope to kind of extract the social media data that matches the knowledge graph, or do you kind of do it more iteratively? In which case you kind of find out what people are talking about and refine that knowledge graph to extract more information?
Yes, great question. Thanks for that. So first of all, I mean, currently we are not yet systematically enriching this as a byproduct of our analysis. So we're bootstrapping our knowledge graph with a number of public data sources that exist out there, and also we have internal pharma experts that enrich this manually. When we do specific projects with our clients, we enrich this manually. I mean, currently we are exactly in the process of figuring out how to do this in a more bootstrapping based way. So basically by seeing what sort of concepts that we find in text that cannot be mapped to our knowledge graph, and then trying to come up with automatic suggestions of where to place these concepts in our knowledge graph. So this is something that we are currently working on, but we haven't yet in production.
I have some other question that's about the anonymity of the data you mentioned. Is this something that you decided to do, or are there some, I don't know, guidelines that say this has to be anonymous? Because I mean, the patients, they do this on their own, and they put their name if they decide they want to, and they don't have to do this.
Yes. Well, we do this for I would say different reasons, really. So one reason is, yes, our clients also request this because there are some issues with pharmacovigilance, in the sense that if you spot, for example, a certain side effect and you can trace this down to a particular individual, there are some requirements to report this. So this is important really for our clients, that they are not able to identify a specific individual. Okay, I think from our perspective there are clearly ethical reasons why we do this, and we always strive for ensuring ethical principles in the way we process data. And the third point is a legal point, because I mean, you know that in Europe since some time we have what we call the GDPR, which is a data protection, quite comprehensive data protection law, that rightfully for anyone processing data forces them to look at the trade-off between how much do we gain from this analysis versus how much do we potentially violate the rights of people that have sort of put this or have created this content or disclosed this content. And I mean, we've done this exercise of documenting this trade-off. I mean, this is we're obliged by European law to document how we resolve this trade-off. And so anonymization is part of the picture, because we say that if we anonymize and we never break this down to an individual, then the harm that we do to any single person that has shared this content on is very low compared to the gains we get as society of being able to invest our resources better into the healthcare system. And yeah, these are the three reasons. Maybe that was a bit lengthy, but I think it's an important topic. So yeah.
Thanks. Any questions? Any more questions from somebody else? Okay, if not, I have a final question, and then you have 1 minute or so to think about yours. With how many languages can you work? Because the example were all in English.
Yes. So we work with 11 languages currently that we offer off the shelf. We work with maybe as Soufian knows the languages, I tend to forget this. I'm sorry for that. Soufian gets now time to prepare for for this. We work using state-of-the-art machine translation systems. So we translate these languages into basically English as the lingua franca that our algorithms work on. I mean the reason is that it's quite, of course, a high investment for us to invest in annotating data. I mean, we do everything by ourselves, so we don't use any external data sets. We have a high quality process in place to annotate the data with people that are trained for years on this. And so it would be quite expensive for us to do this for all these languages. So we translate into English. And our current challenge is actually how do we maximize the quality of translation, because we observe that in the domain we work on, the translation, the off-the-shelf translation systems that exist are not very good, because they are typically trained on, I don't know, different kinds of data, on website texts or on proceedings that are translated in different languages. So we have a huge domain adaptation problem, and we're currently working with different research organizations also in Europe to see if we can domain adapt the translation services to our domain and prevent a lot of translation errors from things that are established medical terms, but are translated in a completely weird fashion. Soufian, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you said it all.
Do you remember what are the 11 languages we're currently supporting? Do you remember?
There are a lot of European languages and also Chinese.
So we do most of the important European ones plus Chinese, because that's of course a very huge market also for the pharmaceutical companies.
Okay,
And Japanese,
cool.
yeah.
I didn't expect 11 languages. I thought it's maybe 3. So it's English for sure, probably German, because you're working in Germany.
No, we do.
That's really cool.
We do French, of course, as well. We do Spanish. Yeah. So
yeah.
And we onboard new ones if we have a customer that requires a new language. Then we typically are able also to onboard this, given some time. But off the shelf, we support those 11 ones, the main European ones, and Chinese.
Nice, very cool. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank you again for this interesting talk. It was nice seeing you again.
Yes,
and then I hand over to Erin.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you to Philipp and Soufian for giving a talk. Yeah, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the day, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Enjoy your day. Bye.